For a village in the suburbs of Ernakulam, the morning of October 3rd, 2006 arrived with the smell of kerosene and a scene so brutal that the whole country would soon be talking about it. In the weeks that followed, a name would surface, a name that became folklore, the kind of name parents used to frighten children, the kind the newspapers printed in the heightened language usually reserved for natural disasters. They called him the Ripper. The trouble is, 20 years from the crime, nobody can tell you for certain whether he actually did it. This is a story about a monster, or it's the story about how a country builds one when it needs one. This is the story of the Ripper of Kerala. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest stories from around South Asia. I'm your host Aryan.
And I'm Aishwarya.
Aishwarya, our comment sections and DMs are filled with some of, I would say, the craziest crime and horror film and show recommendations. Right?
Yep.
Like you'd agree?
Absolutely.
It is impossible for us to watch all of them. I know for a fact you
try.
try.
I
You
really do try. But guys, the tables have turned today because we have a recommendation for you.
So Ash got early access to Z5's new show called Brown. It is starring Karishma Kapoor. And so she saw it. And I got the whole DL and I had to watch a few episodes too. It is crazy.
We loved it.
There's a serial killer on the loose.
Karishma Kapoor has returned in a genre that is right up our alley.
Yeah.
This is about as Desi crime as it gets.
This is one of the fun things about being a true crime podcast is like we get early access to films and shows. This is one of those moments where we did. And I really think you should check it out because it's set in Kolkata. So it took me back to the Parthok, the Kolkata House of Horror case. Except the lead here is a alcoholic female detective.
Correct.
So that kind of turns the script on your traditional protagonist who is a sort of a male drunk.
Yeah.
It's nice to see a female drunk.
Or even a traditional male cop.
But her character of Rita Brown has this sidekick played by Surya Sharma. His name is Arjun. He has his own set of baggage that he comes in with.
Much like my sidekick.
My own set of baggage. Thank God we're not solving any crimes.
The killer treats their killings like a ritual. The victim's hands and feet are tied and they are hanged midair. I'll stop right there because for two people who do this every single week, that ritual still genuinely got under our skin. And figuring out who did it is the easy part. It's how and the why that wrecks you. No spoilers from us though. All we can say is that the gruesomeness of it all just keeps you hooked throughout.
The link to Brown is in the description, both on YouTube and for our audio listeners. Go watch it now.
It's out on Z5 on June 5th. Enjoy it. Tell us how you liked it. And with that, on with the case for today. It is the 23rd of December, 2023. Inside the auditorium of the Ernakulam Press Club, a crowd has gathered for what looks on the surface like any ordinary Malayalam book launch. There are flowers on the table, there are cameras lined up at the back. And then the author walks in. He is 56 years old, grayer than the photographs everyone has seen of him, heavier, clean-shaven, except for a thick salt and pepper mustache. He wears glasses now. He looks, to put it plainly, like somebody's uncle. The book in his hands is called Pullari Viriyam Munpe, Before the Dawn Breaks. It is a novel about a death row prisoner named Chidambaram, written, the publishers say, over 17 years by a man who only studied up to the 8th grade. Proceeds from the book will go to children with special needs. And then you notice the police officers. You notice the handcuffs. You notice that the author is here on a 2-day escort parole granted by the Kerala High Court. That his wife and his daughter, a young lawyer named Kirti, are sitting beside him with the kind of careful, watchful posture of people who have been preparing for this moment for a very long time. You notice that the author cannot quite leave the hall on will, that the parole expires tomorrow, that when this is over, he will be returned to a high-security cell in Thrisur's Viur Central Jail, where he is serving a life sentence without parole. Outside the hall, the headlines are still doing what headlines have done for almost 2 decades. They are calling him Kerala's Jack the Ripper. They are calling him the man who chopped off a sleeping woman's hand for the bangles on her wrist. They are calling him an 8-time murderer, a 35-time burglar, a serial killer who once told an interrogator, when asked if he felt remorse, that he only thinks about his wife and children and not about anyone else who should live or die. They are calling him the Ripper. Inside the hall, the author is signing copies of his book. His daughter is taking photographs. And for 17 years, in courtrooms, in interrogation rooms, in handwritten letters from a series of prisons he kept escaping from, the author has been saying the same thing over and over to anyone who will listen. I did not do any of it. The police framed me to solve unsolved crimes. I confessed under torture. They fabricated evidence against me. I was an easy target because I had no money, no social leaders or political parties to help me. So, which one is true? The author or the Ripper? The man at the press club or the monster in the headlines? What makes this one of the most uncomfortable stories in modern South Indian crime is not the body count. It is not the prison breaks. It is not the 8th grade fisherman who taught himself to write a novel from inside a death row cell. It is the fact that 2 decades after his arrest, after years of ink and headline and folklore, after a death sentence and a life sentence and a chase through 3 central jails, almost nobody can tell you with any certainty how many people he actually killed. But before we get to these questions and their even more terrifying answers, we must go back in time. Back in a time to when there wasn't a Ripper, just a woman sleeping soundly. Her name was Devaki. People in the village called her Baby. She was 51 years old. Her husband Ramakrishnan, 60, was a retired soldier. The two of them lived in a quiet, modest house in Puthinvelikara, a panchayat on the very northern edge of Ernakulam district, where the Periyar river forks into a confluence and the lanes run dark at night because there are no street lights. Just paddy fields and shrimp ponds and the slow blue glow of television sets in distant houses. It was the 2nd of October, 2006, Gandhi Jayanti, a national holiday, and the village was asleep. What happened next, we only know in fragments. We know it because of what investigators pieced together later, and because of what the survivors of the night could remember when they finally woke up. We know that sometime around 1 in the morning, a man came in through an unlocked door. He was about 5 feet tall, thinning hair, a thin beard, a heavy mustache. He carried an iron rod that he had stolen, the police would later say, from a building site nearby. The first person he found asleep was Ramakrishnan. He hit him on the head twice with the iron rod. The retired soldier did not die. He would survive, technically, with permanent and irreversible brain damage that he would carry for the rest of his shortened life. Then the man walked across the house to where Devaki was sleeping, alone, and brought the rod down on her head and her face until she stopped moving. And then he did the thing that would, more than anything else, send this case rolling into folklore. He took out a knife. He stripped Devaki bare, and he sliced off her left hand at the wrist, not to defile her, but for a reason that was in its own way more disturbing for being so callous. She was wearing 6 gold bangles that he could not slip off her swollen wrist. So he removed the wrist. He took the bangles. He took a gold necklace from her neck. He took 1,300 rupees from a clay piggy bank in the other room. And then, before he left, he opened the cooking gas cylinder in the kitchen, splashed kerosene around the house, and walked out into the dark, leaving the place to fill quietly with fumes. This, the investigators believed, was meant to ignite the home when the morning sun hit the right angle and to burn the house down before anyone could find what was inside. But it did not ignite. The house did not burn. Instead, the next afternoon, a friend of Devaki's named Shyamla showed up at the gate, wondering why nobody was answering. She smelled the kerosene first, then the gas. She opened a window, and she became, in her own words, the first person to witness what she would describe for the rest of her life as a dreadful scene. A woman naked in her own bedroom, a hand missing, a husband across the house barely alive, a kitchen still hissing with gas. This is the moment that ends an ordinary night in an ordinary village in Kerala. And it is the moment that begins a manhunt. Because you see, Kerala in October 2006 was not used to this. Mass killings are not unheard of in the state. They happen, they shock, but they recede. This was something else. This was the kind of crime that Malayalam press reported in the heightened hothouse language usually reserved for Malayalam blockbusters. There were front page diagrams of the house. There were vivid reconstructions of the wrist, the bangles, the iron rod, the kerosene. 24-hour news channels were a relatively new thing in Kerala in the mid-2000s, and they competed with each other and with the older newspapers to put more flesh on the story than the story itself could really bear. And the panic spread. In Puttin Velekara, men began organizing themselves into nightly vigilante squads, walking the lanes with sticks and knives, watching for strangers. Mothers stopped letting children play outside after sundown. According to one account collected later by Nidish MK, the journalist who would spend a year reopening this case, a middle-aged man in the village was nearly beaten to death by a mob one night when he stepped outside his house to relieve himself. The mob had assumed he was the burglar coming back. Locks were checked twice, windows were nailed shut. The story moved from a single household in a single panchayat into the nightmare vocabulary of the entire state of Kerala. The police were under enormous pressure. The chief minister at the time was being asked about the case in the state assembly. The local MLA was being asked about it in his constituency. The local press was running daily updates on a case where, for nearly 2 months, there were no real updates to run. The killer had left almost nothing useful behind. The iron rod and the knife, both eventually pulled out of the household well, had been submerged for hours and yielded almost no usable trace. The sniffer dogs, brought in early, lost the scent in the kerosene. The only physical descriptions came from a neighbor named Ginny, who said a man broke into her house the day before, took an electric torch, and was gone. A torch that turned up later in Devaki's house suggesting the same person. So a description was published, around 5 feet tall, bald or balding, beard, heavy mustache, the kind of description that in rural Kerala fits an enormous number of fishermen, labourers and tea stall workers. The kind of description that is, in policing terms, almost useless, but in folkloric terms, almost perfect. It is general enough to become a face you might see at the bus stand, in the toddy shop, in the mirror. That is when the papers began calling the unknown attacker the Ripper. The name had nothing to do with the actual mechanics of the attack, of course, because Devaki had been bludgeoned, not ripped. But the imagination of the Kerala press, which had been raised on the same global pulp tradition as the rest of the world, looked for a familiar prefix, and Jack the Ripper was the name they had reached for. Kerala's Jack the Ripper of the backwaters, the Ripper of Puttin Velekara. By the third week of November, almost 2 months had passed without an arrest. The pressure on the local police was extreme, and it was at this point, sometime in the second half of November 2006, that the entire story shifted onto a new track. A track that, depending on whom you ask, ended either with the capture of one of the most dangerous men in Kerala's modern history, or with the destruction of one of its most ordinary citizens. But before we get to the dichotomy of extraordinary or ordinary, we need to talk about a man named Thampi. Thampi was a small-time fisherman from rural Ernakulam who had a long, low-grade record with the local police. Petty thefts, market scuffles, the kind of name that turned up in police diaries every other month for offences nobody really thought about twice. According to the version recounted years later by a constable named Vinayan, who was attached to the task force investigating Devaki's murder, Thampi was actually their first real suspect. He fit that rough general description, short, bald, with a record. He had absconded recently after a warrant was issued against his name for an unrelated brawl. The team had nothing else, so they decided he was their best lead. Vinayan tracked Thampi down through a mutual acquaintance and, by his own account given to journalist Nidish MK, persuaded the man to come in for what was framed as an interview with the warrant on the brawl held over his head as leverage. Now, Nidish was researching this case under a fellowship from Project 39A, a project which is a death penalty research and legal aid program at the National Law University in Delhi. And he is a key figure in this story, so I want you to remember him. But coming back to the story, Vinayan said he sat with Thampi at some point during the meeting and made it very clear what would happen if Thampi did not start naming names. The constable says to the accused, "If we don't take you, the crime branch of the CBI will." Thampi understood. And then he said, "I'm nothing, sir. I've only been in minor brawls. Sir, there is a more evil man. Do you know a person named Jayanandan? The man Thampi was naming was a 38-year-old fisherman from a village called Poya, about 10 kilometers from Puthinvelekara. This man was a class 8th dropout, a husband, a father of 2 young daughters. He fished at night using Chinese fishing nets, the structures that line the backwaters of central Kerala, and he slept in the mornings, which is what fishermen who fish at night do. He was deep in debt. His neighbors were labourers and tea sellers and mechanics. His caste, the Kudumbis, were a Konkani-speaking community that had fled Goa during the Portuguese Inquisition centuries earlier and settled into the marshlands as shrimp cultivators. And they had been more or less continuously on the wrong end of every economic ladder available in Kerala ever since. But you see, years later, Thampi would tell Nidish in a phone call he made shortly before disappearing into hiding to avoid yet another police inquiry that what he had told the constable that day had been a lie. Quote, "Yes, man, I lied. You do whatever you want." Then he hung up with an expletive. But by the time Thampi said this quote lie, if that's what it even was, it had already done its work. Now, here is where the story splits in two, and you listening to this will have to decide which version sounds more like the truth to you. Version 1 is the one that the police told. According to the police record, KP Jayanandan was arrested in the morning on the 23rd of November 2006. He was taken into the station, interrogated, and within hours he was offering up not just the murder of Devaki, but a string of unsolved killings stretching back 3 years. The headboards of elderly people, gold bangles cut from sleeping wrists, burning kerosene, a confession that, by the time it was over, named 7 dead, not 1, and dozens of robberies. And then you have version 2, that is the one told by Jayanandan's wife, Indira. She has held this version consistently for nearly 20 years, and she told it again to Nidish when he visited her in the family's small, unfinished house in rural Thrissur. According to Indira, on the morning of 21st of November 2006, almost 2 months after the murder, her husband left the house to go fishing and just never came back. Some men in a jeep, neighbors said, had pulled him in. She panicked. She went to the relatives went to the police, and the police told her nothing. 2 days later, on the 23rd, she opened the newspaper and saw her husband described as a serial killer. 2 days. That is 48 hours. 48 hours of which the official police record contains nothing at all. 48 hours during which Jayanandan has consistently maintained he was held in a hidden chamber, blindfolded, stripped, shackled, and tortured into confessing to crimes he says he had nothing to do with. Now, ordinarily, a claim like this would be one prisoner's word against the police's, and we would have no way to weigh it. But in this case, something extremely unusual happened. The retired Deputy Superintendent of Police who had actually conducted that interrogation, R.K. Krishnakumar, sat down for a long, recorded interview with Nidish in his own home almost 2 decades later. And in that interview, with the recorder running, he described his interrogation methods in detail. Krishnakumar described what he called, quote, special therapy he had developed years earlier using a pickpocket as the test case. He described the philosophy of it, that criminals, in his view, pass through stages. They appeal to your humanity, they play the innocent, they cry for help, and only then do they break. He described how he would have a suspect placed in a small windowless room and would open every window in the surrounding building so that the suspect would scream and would learn that no one was coming for him. He described, with what sounded like a certain professional pride, how he had made Jayanandan run on a treadmill, blindfolded, before placing him in the room. Then he was placed in a room where he yelled and attempted to bang his head against the walls. We were aware that he had no option but to confess after that. He was blindfolded when he was brought into the room. I went to that extent in this case as well. On the question of physical torture, Krishna Kumar was more cautious in his testimony. He told Nidish that no external injuries would be visible, that proper interrogation could be done without damaging vital organs. Jayanandan's post-arrest medical evaluation on the official record found no wounds. But the village residents who saw him when the police later brought him out for the staged evidence recovery walkthroughs remembered a man who could not stand up on his own. Quote, Jayanandan couldn't even stand up, one local community leader told Nidish, asking not to be named. Quote, they had to help him walk by letting him rest his hands on their shoulders. It was all over in about 5 minutes. End quote. You know what this reminds me of?
What?
The special interrogation tactics employed by the CIA in Guantanamo.
Yep.
And every person defending those, the people, the scientists that came up with the scientific interrogation technique that said, oh no, these are just special tactics. They don't really hurt you. What
Yeah.
are you doing? You're waterboarding. You're psychologically torturing somebody.
Right.
I mean, it is glaring to me that Krishna Kumar goes on to say, with pride, we gave him no option but to confess.
That is so terrifying to me. And he's being recorded. So this man has pure, absolute conviction in what he's done.
What you have described as the stages of a guilty person in how they go about in a
The
confession,
stages of an innocent person too.
they sound exactly like what an innocent person would do,
Yeah.
my friend. And when you yourself say you've given somebody no option but to confess, even an innocent person will confess.
In every case we cover, where we have some insight into what has gone down in a police interrogation room, every case in the last 6 years of covering cases for Desi crime, I keep coming back to the realization we as a continent have a problem of no cameras, no footage, no audios of our interrogation. There are no dash cams on cars.
Yeah.
There is no body worn cameras. There are no cameras inside interrogation room. Where is all this footage? I think it is time. It is 2026. The tech is available. By God, the tech
And
has
it
been
is,
available
and
for
it
a
is not a
decade and
cost
more.
that is. It's not us saying, it's every street lamp should have solar panels in India. That's not the.
No.
This is a very basic body cam. I understand too many police officers, but interrogations at least being recorded. And I'll take a step further back from a analyzing interrogation tactics. Of course, you don't have to give the accused ice cream
Of course
and coddle them. That's not what anybody is saying here. This is not out of empathy for the accused. Also, mind you, I do have empathy for the accused, don't get me wrong. I'm more utilitarian in going, every study ever done on efficiency of interrogation tactics has showed it is always better to become a friend of the accused rather than being agonistic.
But Aran, you're saying all this, and the only thing I can think of is it's not the police's job to determine whether this person is the accused or not.
That's also true.
You don't know.
I mean, and again, I understand certain convoluted tactics being
Of
applied
course.
days into your own investigation and you going, this is our guy. 48 hours?
You don't know.
When another man who has a record of petty crimes, somebody who can commit petty crimes can also lie to get the heat off of him. Again, I'm not saying you didn't have evidence. You didn't have any that you pointed out. You just had a testimony. And that isn't sufficient for you to go for special interrogation tactics.
Nothing is, in my opinion. It's really bewildering to me that there is more accountability inside mall elevators where kids find it hard to make out because there's a guard watching than there is inside our police stations. I think there is time for that accountability.
According to Indra, when she finally saw her husband in custody days later, his head bore a long, fresh mark from what she said he later told her was a chenda coal, the thick wooden stick used to beat the chenda, a Kerala temple drum. He told the family that he had been kept naked and shackled in a secret chamber, plastered head to foot with sugar syrup, and fed to ants. To this preposterous interrogation technique, Krishna Kumar had this to say, quote, everybody has an opinion about illegal detention. Those who support human rights in general do not recognize the risks that the police take. End quote. It appears to me that the risk the police is taking here is not letting themselves be bit by the ants, that they are letting the accused being bit off. There is one more thing about Krishna Kumar that Nidesh discovered while walking around Puttin Velekara. The villagers, almost in passing, mentioned that the deputy SP was actually a distant relative of Devaki's. When Nidesh asked Krishna Kumar about this directly, the officer admitted it. Yes, I am related to her. He insisted that this had not biased his investigation. He insisted that he had no personal stake in the matter. And it was at the end of those 48 unaccounted for hours that Jayanandan, according to the police, sat down and began to confess. Began to confess after ants littered his sugar syrup drenched body. He first confessed to Devaki. then to a couple in their own bed in Mathikalam, to a mother and her young daughter-in-law in Mala, to an elderly woman alone in Vadakekara, to security guard at a liquor outlet in Paravur. 7 people in 3 years. The Ripper, the police told the press the next morning, had finally been caught. Now, this is the part where in most true crime stories, we'd be giving you a tour of the body count, the kind of montage where the camera moves from the case file after case file and a voice rises behind the images, and by the end of it, you are convinced that you have met a monster. I want to do that. But I want you to listen for the asterisk in every single name. Because the caveat here is loud. Because every single name on this list comes with a footnote. And the footnotes are, in many ways, maybe the actual story. That number 7, that figure, breaks down something like this. You have Panjikaran Jose, age 45 of Mala in Thrissur district. The police said that Jayanandan broke into his house in September 2003, struck him in the head with a crowbar while he was asleep, and walked away with 17,000 rupees and a video cassette player. According to Nidish's review of the court papers, Jayanandan was eventually acquitted in this case. Then you have Nabisa, age 51, and her daughter-in-law, Fawzia, age 23, in Mala. March 2004 is when this case occurred. According to the police narrative, Nabisa woke up to a noise, came out, and was bludgeoned to death along with Fawzia during the same robbery. 32 sovereigns of gold were taken. 2 children and another young woman in the house were severely injured but survived. The case was eventually heard by the CBI Special Court, which acquitted Jayanandan in April 2008. Acquitted. The judge, according to a UNI news report cited by Nidish, observed that there was no reliable evidence to connect the accused to the crime. Then you have Kala Sahadevan, age 64, and his wife Nirmala, age 58, of Perinjanam under Mathikalam police station. The year is October of 2004. The trial court convicted Jayanandan in 2008 and sentenced him to death, with the principal sessions judge B. Kamal Pasha calling it, quote, rarest of rare case, in language that the journalist's review of the judgment preserves verbatim. Quote, cruel, inhuman, extreme, brutal, gruesome, diabolic, revolting, and dastardly, end quote. If those weren't enough adjectives to add to your lexicon, I don't know what would be. In 2010, the Kerala High Court overturned the conviction. The High Court found the evidence to be, in the dry words of the bench, shoddy and manufactured. It turns out when you use lesser adjectives, you say more. It ruled that the gold ingot the prosecution had produced as the recovered loot could not be traced to the actual jewelry the couple had even owned. The Supreme Court upheld the acquittal in 2015. Again, mind you, acquittal.
Of course, the gold ingot couldn't be traced back to the stolen loot. Like, what the hell? This is the most convenient narrative. You're saying one man stole this loot, but he took it, he melted it. Here is the melted gold, and this is what he stole.
Yeah.
You have no way of knowing. It's
No.
melted gold.
I'll tell you what they did. They did an isotope analysis by sending it to CERN in Switzerland. They send the gold sample.
This is so absurd.
It's absurd. You can't prove it's gold. You're saying the gold changed completely to a new jewelry type and you have somehow been able to trace it.
Yeah.
Girl,
Same
you
gold.
haven't been able to pull fingerprints. You're telling me you
Anything.
did an isotope analysis and somehow found atomic similarity.
They're not even claiming that.
They're not claiming.
saying
I'm making that,
was gold. This is gold. Same.
Gold. It's the pineapple, apple pen of the Kerala police. I mean, this is absurd.
I'm laughing because this is absurd. This is so tragic.
And again, I want to believe that there is somebody who ties all these killings together and is the answer.
I hope so.
We all hope for justice.
All I'm seeing is one journalist from NLU Delhi ripping apart a thread.
He's the Ripper.
He is the Ripper in the best way. He's like, what the hell?
But let's keep breaking this number 7 down further. Because then you have Subhashakkan, the security guard at the Kerala State Beverages Corporation outlet in North Paravur. It's August 2005. This man was killed with an iron rod, according to the police, after he challenged Jayanandan and a partner during an attempted robbery. The case is interesting for a reason most coverage of the Ripper conveniently obscures. When Subhashakkan was first killed, the police initially did not even look at Jayanandan. They believed the guard had been killed because he was a witness in an unrelated political murder, and then they prosecuted other people for it. Only after Jayanandan's 2006 arrest did the police announce that he had also confessed to This. He pleaded not guilty in court, and he was eventually, drum roll, acquitted. Then you have Elikutti, aged 85, of the same region. It's May 2005. She's an elderly woman who's alone in her home, and lo and behold, she too was killed with a blow to the head during a robbery. Jayanandan was convicted in this case in 2011 and sentenced to rigorous life imprisonment. We will come back to this case shortly because it is one of the only two that resulted in a final conviction, and it is one in which the central piece of evidence was a fingerprint on a broken mirror, a fingerprint that, as we will see, comes with its own enormous question marks. And then we have Devaki, the woman we started this case with, the hand at the wrist, the bangles, the kerosene, the death sentence in 2008, later commuted by the Kerala High Court in 2016 to life imprisonment without parole, and then modified by the Supreme Court to a life term with the possibility of release after 20 years. This is the only case in which the Supreme Court has explicitly held that Jayanandan's guilt was proven beyond reasonable doubt, though again, we will get to what that conviction actually rests on and what it does not. There are also two further attacks that did get mentioned in police filings and news coverage, even though they did not result in deaths. These include Arvind Panikkar and his wife Omana, who were attacked in their home, severely injured, 18 sovereigns of gold ornaments stolen. But they survived. And then much later, in December 2021, 15 years after the original arrest, the Kerala police announced that Jayanandan had also been the killer in a brutal double murder from May 2004 in Ponnekara in Ernakulam. Two elderly siblings this included, V. Nanikutti Amal, 73, and her brother Rajan, 60, beaten to death. The woman, according to police, assaulted before being killed. In this case, 40 sovereigns of gold being taken. The 2021 booking was reportedly based on a self-revelation Jayanandan had made to a fellow prisoner, which was then reported to the crime branch. Jayanandan denies it. And again, to me, when you're taking another prisoner's word for a crime, you need to have evidence to substantiate that. Unless Jayanandan is confessing these to you directly, taking another co-criminal's word for it, a co-criminal that is aware of Jayanandan's case, is aware of the fact that there is news about stuff being fabricated against him, how can you just take his word against Jayanandan's word? As of the most recent reporting available, that case has not gone to trial. So when you hear the headline figures, 7 murders, 35 robberies, 8 murders, 23 cases, what you're actually looking at is a number that has been moving for 2 decades, depending on which year you read about it, which paper, which officer is being quoted, and which conviction has just been overturned. I want to be very honest with you about what we can and cannot say with any confidence. The figure of quote 7 murders during a span of 35 robberies, which appears verbatim on the Wikipedia page and in much of the early 2000s Malayalam press, traces back to the original police statement at the time of Jayanandan's arrest. It is not a court finding. It is a police claim, repeated, eventually canonized. Of those 7 names, the court has convicted Jayanandan in 2. Elikutti and Devaki. They've acquitted him in 3, and 2 more names attached to him in early reports either never produced a charge sheet or have not yet gone to trial. So the man currently sitting in Viewer Central Jail, depending on whether you're asking the police, the press or the judiciary, is either an 8-time murderer or a 2-time one or innocent. The gap between these answers is the entire story. Now we come to the man of the hour. The maverick, the journalist, Nidesh MK, who drove out to Thrisur's Viewer Central Jail and waited at a barricaded window in the visitors area. After a while, an older man in white prison clothes appeared on the other side of the bars. Nidesh has described in his eventual long-form report for the News Minute in March 2023 what struck him about the first meeting. The figure across the bars looked nothing like the photographs that had been circulating for nearly 2 decades. The gaunt, dark-eyed 38-year-old who had been paraded by the press at the time of arrest. The man was 54, heavier, greyer, clean-shaven except for that thick mustache, with thick-rimmed glasses, and he spoke calmly and with what Nidesh described with some surprise and authority. And what he said was the same thing he had said to a magistrate in 2006, the same thing he had said to every court since, the same thing he would say to anyone who would listen. I have not done it. Now, prisoners say this. Folks that are guilty do say that. They say this all the time. Saying it does not make it true. What makes the case worth taking seriously enough to spend a year on it was not Jayanandan's denial. It was a discovery Nadish made less than a month into the investigation while sitting in the dust of a Kerala court records room going through the thousands of pages of old case files. While sifting through these pages tucked inside the police file from the Devaki case, the case that put Jayanandan on death row, mind you, the case that the Supreme Court would eventually uphold, was a chemical analysis report. The report was on the green shirt and the saffron mundu the police had recovered from Jayanandan's house. The clothes that the prosecution had told the trial court were soaked in Devaki's blood, the clothes that had become, in the public imagination, almost more famous than the man wearing them. The chemical analysis report said, in the dispassionate language of a forensics laboratory, that the garments showed no traces of blood. None. Not some, none. That report had not been brought up at the trial. According to Nadish, who reproduced images of the document in his published investigation, it had simply sat in the file. There was a second chemical report on the iron rod that had been pulled from the household well, the murder weapon. That report also showed, drum roll, no traces of blood. At trial, the police explained this by saying the rod had spent a day submerged in well water. Jayanandan's defense disputed this. The trial court accepted the police explanation. Then, there was the iron rod itself. A building contractor named Vishwanathan, from whom the police said the rod had been stolen in the days before the murders, was called to identify it in court. He testified on the stand that the iron rod the police had presented as evidence was not the rod he had lost. Not the rod. He was declared a hostile witness. Then there was the gold, the bangles, the necklace, the reason supposedly the whole thing had happened. The police produced a small quantity of gold jewelry in court and asked Devaki's surviving relatives to identify it. They identified it. They confirmed on the witness stand that this was the gold cut from Devaki's wrist that night. Years later, though, a relative of Devaki's, speaking to Nadish on the condition of anonymity, said that the family had known the gold was not the original. The police, the relative said, had told them that the actual gold had been melted down at the pawn shop and could not be recovered, and that without producing some gold in court, this case would collapse. So the family agreed to identify random pieces of gold the police produced because they had been told for months that the man on trial was the man who killed Devaki. They had read it in the papers, they had heard it from the neighbors, they had no reason to suspect otherwise. And while all that is true, there is blame that is to be ascribed to people that knowingly pin blame on somebody they don't know for a fact to be guilty. The relative gave Nadish a number. The original gold weighed 22 grams. The gold produced in court was 18. Quote, everyone, including police, prosecutors, and witnesses, knew it was not the original, the relative said. Now, there was one witness who had not played along. Devaki's friend Shamla, the same Shamla who had opened the window and smelled the kerosene and seen the body. She had been called to identify the gold. According to her own testimony in court and to her interview with Nadish years later, she had panicked on the stand. Quote, the courtroom intimidated me. Everyone chastised me after I mentioned it wasn't the same gold. End quote. She too had been declared a hostile witness. Now I want to ask you guys, is a hostile witness one that gives testimony that doesn't align with your preconceived notion of where the case should head? Or is a hostile witness one that flips their testimony when under duress? These aren't hostile witnesses. These are the witnesses that you want in a democracy and a justice system where justice is to be upheld.
Aran, when we have cases like these where the system is failing so bafflingly, and I think one of the cases we had was of the two young girls in the rural UP village where they were hung from a tree.
The Katra killings.
The Katra killings. There is a feeling of so much helplessness of where do you go? Where do you go when the court will say, differing opinion, out. Evidence report that maybe proves otherwise, hidden. The police will do that. The court will do that. Same way in the Katra killings, when your autopsy is being conducted by the man who sweeps the hospital, where do you go? There is nowhere to go. And this is 2006. We're not talking about the 1970s, the 1960s.
You know, we've been true crime podcasters for 6 years now. People ask us, how do these cases affect you? And of course, there is a certain level of desensitization you and I have towards gore, towards blood, towards murder. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but it's just a fact. There's a certain desensitization. But after more than 200 cases, 6 years of covering, I have never been able to be desensitized against
I agree.
this system
Yeah.
of indifference, this system of lacuna, this system that fails its own citizens,
Yeah.
the taxpayers, the voters. I feel such rage in going over this. And it's easy to say this is a systemic failure, and that obscures the blame from the people that were there in the courtroom. It's their fault also. This is not just a systematic fault. This is people that reek of cowardice, of laziness, of
An uncomfortable truth that doesn't fit a narrative of possibly having their family members murdered and never be caught. And so rather put it on someone who isn't to blame.
cops that instead of tracing 7 murders and solving 7 independent murders, or what could be independent murders, go, actually, it's easier to just pin it on the guy that's in front of me right now.
You know, you and I, we discuss this. I know we feel it in our hearts. We say it on the podcast sometimes as well. India is so circumspect, so restrained with its death penalty. We say that as a matter of pride. As a developing country, we're not hanging people left, right, and center. And that's a matter of principle. We're using the death penalty when it is to be used as a tool where we can no longer have rehabilitation, but we're not putting innocent people on death row. But then I see this and I'm like, thank God. And it's no longer a matter of pride. I no longer feel pride that we're restrained that way. It's a feeling of this system has so many holes. Thank God we're not putting more people on death row. Because God, how many innocent people would we kill?
I can name one off the top of my head, named Dhananjoy.
Right. Just gone, a life gone.
But if the hostilities end there against the so-called hostile witnesses, they don't. Because then there was the pawn shop, Thomason Enterprises in Chalakurdi. The court was told that Jayanandan had walked into the pawn shop on the 2nd of October 2006 within hours of killing Devaki, pawned the gold under a relative's name, and returned days later to sell it outright. The shop's manager, Babu, had testified to the court that he had personally seen Jayanandan walk in. When Nadish tracked Babu down, by then working as a manager at a clothing shop in a different town, Babu retracted his testimony. He said he had never seen Jayanandan in the shop in his life. He had been instructed by his now deceased boss, the original owner of Thompson Enterprises, to testify in court because the shop needed a witness on record. He had assumed the police had the right man because the newspapers said so. Quote, "What else could I have done?" he said. He had not even been at the shop the day the police later said the transaction took place. He had been out running errands. Then there was the clay piggy bank, broken open in a canal near the village. The charge sheet said Jayanandan had led the police to this canal and that they had recovered the broken piggy bank as a result. A retired head constable named Shibu, who had been at the Puttin Velikara station at the time, told Nadish a different story. The police had been searching desperately for weeks, Shibu said, and by his own account had gone to consult an astrologer who had told him to look in a canal. He had searched and he had found the shards. The piggy bank, in other words, had been found before Jayanandan was ever brought to the canal, but the charge sheet placed Jayanandan at the canal as the source of the recovery. There was also the timeline. The police had told the court that Devaki was killed at 1 in the morning on the 2nd of October, based on the post-mortem report. They had told the court that her husband Ramakrishnan had been attacked first, in another room. But the medical report on Ramakrishnan, when Nitish read it carefully, indicated that his head injuries had been inflicted approximately 12 hours before he was rushed to the hospital. That would place the attack on Ramakrishnan in the late evening of the 2nd, hours after Devaki, who was killed in the morning, in the wee hours. This is, on the face of it, an enormous discrepancy. The police did not explain it in court. The court did not press them to. But there was the case where they did get a fingerprint. The Alekkutti murder, the 85-year-old woman in Vadakekara. This is one of the only 2 convictions against Jayanandan that stuck. This case is unusual because for the first and only time in any of the Ripper cases, there was a single piece of forensic material evidence, a fingerprint of Jayanandan's recovered from a broken mirror at the crime scene. There was no DNA, there was no other prints, there was, as far as the case file shows, just the one mirror and the one print. Now, if this is all true, that is substantial evidence, don't get me wrong. But the mirror went missing during the trial. And why did it go missing? Because Jayanandan claimed in court that the investigating officer had handed him a mirror to hold during questioning in order to manufacture the print. The court did not accept this. But the central, irreplaceable piece of physical evidence in the only case where physical evidence was claimed to exist was, by the time the appellate process began, gone. And the gold from the Ernakulam case, the police said, had also been melted into an ingot. The same explanation the Kerala High Court, ruling on the Sahadevan and Nirmala double murder, had explicitly rejected as inadmissible because it was impossible to trace a melted ingot to specific stolen jewellery. In Ernakulam's case, the trial court accepted it, however. Jayanandan said he wanted to appeal that conviction, but he could not because, after all this, he had no money. This is what Nadish found in 12 months of digging. Not a story of a man who was definitively innocent, because that is not a story a journalist working alone can ever tell, but a story of a case that when you actually opened it up and looked inside, did not contain what the public had been told for nearly 20 years it contained. A retired policeman bragged on tape about how he extracted the confession. A pawn shop manager said he had never seen the suspect. A relative of the victim said the gold was planted. A neighbor who found the victim said the murder weapon was not the murder weapon. A chemical report said the bloodied clothes had no blood on them. A central piece of forensic evidence walked out of a courtroom and never came back. Witness after witness said, when finally asked, that they had testified the way they had because the newspapers said so. In the middle of all of it, an 8th grade fisherman from Poya village kept saying, year after year, the same 6 words. I did not do any of it. But here's the problem with believing in KP Jayanandan's innocence, and I want to be honest with you here, because this case asks us to be. The problem is that the man we are talking about is not a passive figure. He has not just sat in a cell for 20 years and waited for somebody to come find the chemical reports. He's done something else. Something that, depending on how you frame it, makes him either the most resourceful, innocent man in Kerala or exactly the kind of hardened operator the police always said he was. He keeps escaping. The first attempt was in 2007 at Viyur Central Prison in Thrissur, where he was being held during the early stages of his trials. According to the news reports of the time, he tried to tunnel out, Shawshank style. The attempt was discovered before he got anywhere. The prison was reinforced. He was watched more closely. And in 2009, he was transferred to the central prison in Kannur in northern Kerala, a move designed to put him further from his support network and make collusion harder. In 2010, he escaped from Kannur. The official reports describe him as having squeezed through the bars of his cell, an extraordinary feat given that maximum security cells are designed precisely to prevent this, possible perhaps only because he was, by all accounts, a thin and slight man and a fisherman who had spent a lifetime working in narrow spaces. He was on the run for less than 2 days before he was recaptured, not even in Kerala. He had crossed the state border into Tamil Nadu and was picked up in the hill town nearby, in Ooty, the kind of holiday town Indian families go to in summer, not criminals on the run. The authorities transferred him back to Viyur on the 21st of June 2010 and tightened everything about how he was held. Then, 3 years later, in June 2013, he made the escape that would turn him into a kind of folk anti-hero. By then, he had been moved to the central prison in Pujapura, in the state capital of Thiruvananthapuram. He was housed in the maximum security condemned cell, a cell reserved for prisoners under the sentence of death. The wall around that section of the prison had been fortified just 2 years earlier in 2011 and topped with an electrified barbed wire fence, specifically because this prison was holding a most wanted terror suspect the Indian intelligence considered a flight risk of the highest order, T. Nazir. So the wall was in theory one of the most secure walls in any prison in southern India. But on the night of the 11th of June 2013, Jayanandan and his cellmate, a man named Prakash Urf Uppa, who was serving a relatively short sentence for vehicle theft and who had only a few months left to serve, left their condemned cell. According to the official reconstruction, they had spent close to 2 months working at the cylindrical dead latch of the cell's grill door using what investigators believed was a hacksaw blade smuggled in. They had used soap paste during the day to mask the cuts. They had worked at night when the guards were asleep. By the time they had finished, they could remove one of the bars. They came out of the cell. They went to the prison infirmary. They stole bed sheets and clothes from a clothesline. They walked to a row of bamboo poles that had been left as support for banana plants growing inside the prison compound, dismantled them, lashed them together with the stolen clothes into a crude ladder, and used the ladder to scale the reinforced wall. Shawshank Redemption, you could never.
Wow. Oh my God. I almost want to say something that may not be correct.
Say
I
it.
don't believe it.
Say it.
Actually, but I'm gonna say,
Say it.
If someone wants to be free this badly, because not all prisoners clearly
No.
want to be free this badly.
No.
This is like a 1 in 100,000. I don't even know what statistic prisoner. You might as well be left alone.
Why does the movie Shawshank Redemption work? It's a film that didn't do well when it came out in the theaters, but today
It
is
didn't?
Nope. And today is one of the greatest films in IMDb web pages. Because the person digging out from the get-go of the film was portrayed as maybe innocent,
Yeah.
and eventually
Was.
fully innocent when the other cellmate walked in, who said that, who was declared a hostile witness and killed by the warden. This is that. It is very few cases we have covered cases of people escaping police custody. Keep in mind, custody is different. So when you think of somebody escaping the police, there is one which is escaping while being transported.
Yeah.
We have that when it comes to the highway killer we did. He escaped when the police had him and were transporting him. That is the police's a police mishap of sorts. This is somebody that is using all their brain
Yeah.
for a single purpose.
And whatever they can scourge up in prison.
This is somebody that craves freedom, that has not been assuaged by the guilt of his crimes and made peace with them.
Yeah.
The prison surveillance camera network was reportedly down at the time owing to, the report said, perhaps too conveniently, to a power outage. In most cases, that just means the cameras aren't working and the police is trying to cover for their horrible infrastructure. They'd also arranged the cots in their cell with vessels and pillows so that the night shift glancing in would see what looked like two sleeping men. It was, as one police officer later admitted to a news media network, an embarrassment. The most fortified condemned cell in Kerala had been defeated with a hacksaw blade, a soap bar, 2 bamboo poles from a banana garden, and a clothesline. Prakash was caught within days. He had returned to his home village in Kollam and made himself, by the police's own description, almost cartoonishly visible, drinking openly at toddy shops, sleeping in the open, buying liquor from the crowded outlets. The police left him at large for several days, hoping Jayanandan would make contact with him. Jayanandan never did. Prakash was picked up on the 19th of June. He told investigators that after the escape, the two of them had hidden for nearly 2 days in the wilderness near Velli railway station in Thiruvananthapuram, surviving on ripe cashew fruit and germinated nuts before splitting up. Jayanandan, he said, had been talking about stealing a small boat from the nearby lagoon and living off the chain of brackish water lagoons that runs up the Kerala coast, a plan that anyone familiar with how Jayanandan had spent his life as a fisherman would recognize as alarmingly plausible. Jayanandan stayed gone for 3 months. During those 3 months, according to investigators, he stole, among other things, 4 decorative domes from the Kodakara temple, used at least 2 stolen SIM cards, moved between Ernakulam, Alapura and Thrissur, and at one point reportedly attended both a day-night protest in Thrissur and a cultural event hosted by the Sahitya Academy. He grew his hair, he used a different name, he survived, for a time, on a prawn farm. But then he was caught, on the 9th of September 2013. The police were tipped off by a member of the public who recognized him. He was waiting at Nelai Junction, a few kilometers from his home village, to get a flat tire fixed on a stolen bicycle. A 4-member team led by a civil policeman named Sijit picked him up. The Home Minister at the time called the team personally to congratulate them. There is a version of all of this that fits the prosecution's view of him perfectly. That he's a clever, restless, fundamentally unreformed criminal, and that the man who can saw through a maximum security cell with a soap-coated hacksaw and live off cashew fruit in the wilderness is plainly the same man who can disable a household gas cylinder and walk away into the dark of Puttinvellekara. There is nothing about this version that contradicts itself. There's also a version where the escapes are something different, where they're not evidence of a serial killer's mind, but of a man who has been told year after year that he's going to be hanged for things he did not do, and who has decided that he would rather take the wilderness and the cashew fruit than the rope. In his own conversations with Nidish, when pressed, Jayanandan called the escapes the worst mistakes of his life. They damaged his cases, his reputation. They turned the police, who already disliked him, into his lifelong personal enemies. One of the officers suspended over the 2013 break because, of course, cops are going to be punished for letting a fugitive go. Jayanandan claims that that officer is the same one who later, in December 2021, framed him for the 17-year-old Ponnekara murder by claiming he had confessed to it in a cellmate's hearing. Both versions, I think, can sit in your head at once. That is part of what this case asks of you. After 2013, the escape stopped. He was moved to Viewer into a new high-security setup designed in part on the lessons of his own jailbreaks. In an unrelated case in 2025, another convict escaped from the central prison in Kannur using a method so similar to Jayanandan's that the press wrote it up as a tribute. Same iron cutter blade, same soap paste over the cuts, same knotted clothes rope, same scaling off the wall. Even out of the news cycle, even out of public memory, Jayanandan had become a kind of textbook. Indra was 36 when her husband was arrested. The two daughters were 11 and 7. They lived in a small unfinished house in rural Thrissur, the kind of house with the bare brick where the plaster runs out. Indra used to help with the fishing, working the Chinese nets with him at night. There was almost no money then. They had only just pawned her wedding chain at the older daughter's earnings to put a deposit down on a van they had been hoping to use for selling vegetables along the highway. And then her husband disappeared on a November morning in 2006. And 2 days later, he was a serial killer in the newspaper. And then, soon after, he was the Ripper. Indra tried in the beginning to fight. She told Nidish more than once that she did not understand the legal system, that the lawyers spoke in a language she could not follow, that the courts were a place she did not know how to behave in. And then there was an incident she has talked about only quietly, almost only once, that closed the door for her on the legal world altogether. She told Nidish that one of the advocates working on the case had offered her a ride home from court one afternoon and had assaulted her in the car. She has not gone back to a courtroom since. Her husband, when she eventually told her to stay away from lawyers. They watched helplessly as the press built a Ripper around the man they knew. Indra and the two girls kept their identities hidden as much as they could from the wider village. They told only close family and a few friends. They tried to live a quiet life inside the surrounding loud one. And the daughters, for reasons that anyone with a heart will understand, even if they don't share, decided not to disappear into shame. The older daughter, Kirti, became a lawyer. She said openly in interviews that she went to law school because of how badly she felt her father had been defended. The younger daughter, Kashmira, is studying to become a doctor, a wish Indra has said that her father had once expressed to her on a prison visit. In 2023, Kirti did something that very few daughters in any country, in any system, have ever done. She filed a petition in the Kerala High Court asking that her father, a convicted multiple murderer serving a life sentence without parole, to be granted a 2-day escort parole to attend the public release of a Malayalam novel he had spent 17 years writing in his cell. On the 21st of December 2023, Justice P.V. Kunhikrishnan of the Kerala High Court granted that parole. In his order, the judge said something that very few Indian judges ever said in a sentence containing the word convict. He said that Jayanandan, in his view, was, quote, entitled to an encomium, a formal expression of praise for what he had managed to write from inside that cell, especially given his formal schooling had ended in his early teens. On the 23rd of December, escorted by police, Jayanandan walked into the Ernakulam press club in handcuffs with his wife and his daughter beside him and released his book. Cameras flashed, reporters wrote it up as a curiosity. Some readers loved the book, others refused to touch it. The first print run sold out. The next day, the parole expired, and there he was back in the jail from where he wrote that book. This is where, in most cases, we would tell you what happens next. With most cases, there is at least an emotional arc that closes. With this one, there isn't. There's just a man in his 60s sitting in a high security cell in Thrissur, where he has been sitting since 2013. He has, by the calendar of the Supreme Court's modified order in his Devaki case, served almost 20 years. He has applied for clemency. He has waited. And there is a question that I want to leave you with, because this is the kind of case that doesn't deserve a clean ending. The kind where I tell you what to think and you nod and we move on. I don't actually know what happened in Devaki's bedroom on the 2nd of October 2006. I don't know if KP Jayanandan walked through that door with an iron rod. I don't know if he is, as the police have always insisted, exactly the man they said he was. A hardened, opportunistic, practiced killer who is now playing the long game, learning to write a novel, learning to behave well, sending his daughter to law school as part of a strategy to engineer an eventual release. That version is consistent with the evidence in the way that the simplest version always is. That version is also consistent with the 2 prison breaks and a sermon to a constable in Sri Lanka. I know it could be true, but I also know that almost every single piece of evidence in his 2 convictions, when actually examined, has either gone missing, been retracted, been planted, or been explained by an officer who openly told a journalist on tape that he had blindfolded the suspect, run him on a treadmill, locked him in a screaming room, and broken him until he confessed. I know that almost 29% of all death sentences handed down by Indian trial courts between 2000 and 2015 were eventually overturned by the Supreme Court. There is a sentence Jayanandan said to a senior officer, K.M. Antony, during one of his many interrogations. The officer asked him whether he felt remorse for everything he had done. The papers reproduce his answer the way they reproduce all of his sentences, like the words of a movie villain. Quote, "I live for my wife and children. Apart from that, I don't think about who else should live or die." It is a sentence that fits a serial killer perfectly. It is also, if you listen to it for more than 1 second, a sentence that fits a fisherman who is being asked in front of his interrogators to atone for things he says he did not do. Pullari virayam munpe means before the dawn breaks, before that light comes. The novel is about a man on death row waiting for a sunrise that may or may not be his execution. Whether what eventually arrives is mercy or proof of the thing he keeps denying, I cannot tell you. Nobody in 2026 can really tell you. The investigation that came closest is the one done by a single journalist working alone with a fellowship from a law school. The system that should have done that work, year after year after year after year, that system has done something else. Until we see you next time, stay safe, stay crazy, and stay desi.
If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.